The order came down from the People's Commissariat of Defense on August 22, 1941, just 2 months after Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and sent more than 3 million troops crashing across the Soviet border. Order Number 2, 127, better known simply as the Vodka Ration Decree, established what would become one of the most distinctive and controversial policies of the Great Patriotic War. Every soldier serving in active combat units of the Red Army would receive exactly 100 grams of vodka per day, delivered at precisely 40% alcohol by volume. This was not a suggestion or a privilege for officers alone. This was a mandated daily ration, as essential to the Soviet war machine as ammunition, fuel, and bread. To understand why Stalin's government made this extraordinary decision, we must look beyond simple stereotypes about Russian drinking culture and examine the brutal mathematics of total war. The specific horrors facing Soviet forces in 1941, and the long historical relationship between armies and alcohol that stretched back centuries before the Bolsheviks ever came to power. When the German Wehrmacht crossed into Soviet territory on June 22, 1941, the Red Army was caught in a state of catastrophic unpreparedness. Stalin had ignored repeated warnings about the impending invasion, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated. The purges of 1937 and 1938 had gutted the officer corps, executing or imprisoning an estimated 30,000 military professionals, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 57 of 85 corps commanders. What remained was an army led largely by political appointees and junior officers thrust into positions far beyond their experience. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. The Western Front collapsed within days. Minsk fell on June 28th. Smolensk was surrounded by mid-July. By September, Leningrad was under siege, and German forces were driving toward Moscow itself. The Red Army suffered losses that defied comprehension. In the first 5 months of the war, Soviet forces lost approximately 3 million men killed, captured, or missing, along with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Soldiers found themselves retreating hundreds of kilometers, fighting desperate rearguard actions, watching their comrades die in numbers that turned entire landscapes into graveyards. It was into this apocalyptic situation that the vodka ration was introduced. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it without precedent. The Russian Imperial Army had maintained vodka rations for centuries, understanding that alcohol served multiple functions in military life. It provided calories in an easily transportable form. It offered psychological relief from the horrors of combat. It helped soldiers endure extreme cold during winter campaigns. It fostered unit cohesion through shared rituals. Most importantly, it dulled fear. When Tsar Nicholas II banned vodka sales at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, attempting to keep the population sober and productive for the war effort, the policy was deeply unpopular among soldiers who had come to expect their daily portion. The Bolsheviks, despite their ideological commitment to creating a new Soviet man free from the vices of the old regime, understood the practical realities of keeping an army functional under extreme stress. During the Russian Civil War, both Red and White forces frequently issued alcohol rations when available, recognizing that soldiers facing death needed more than revolutionary slogans or monarchist nostalgia to sustain their morale. The specific amount of 100 grams was carefully calculated. This quantity, roughly equivalent to 3.5 fluid ounces or about 2 standard shots of modern spirits, represented enough alcohol to provide a noticeable psychological effect without rendering soldiers incapacitated. At 40% alcohol by volume, 100 grams delivered approximately 32 grams of pure ethanol, sufficient to produce mild euphoria, reduced anxiety, and decreased sensitivity to cold in most individuals. The Red Army Medical Corps had studied the effects extensively. They understood that this dosage walked a fine line. Too little, and the ration would provide no meaningful benefit. Too much, and combat effectiveness would be compromised. The goal was not to create drunk soldiers, but to provide what military psychiatrists would later term a pharmacological buffer against combat stress reaction, though they did not use such clinical language at the time. They called it maintaining fighting spirit, preserving morale, and honoring Russian military tradition. The logistics of implementing the vodka ration were staggering. The Soviet Union was already struggling to feed and equip its massive military forces, while simultaneously evacuating industrial capacity eastward ahead of the German advance. Now the government committed to producing and distributing millions of liters of vodka to frontline units every single day. State distilleries that had previously produced industrial alcohol were converted to vodka production. The People's Commissariat of Food Industry coordinated with the military supply system to ensure regular deliveries. Special vodka tanker trucks were manufactured. Quartermasters received training in proper distribution procedures. The ration was to be issued once per day, typically in the evening after combat operations concluded, though frontline commanders had discretion to distribute it before particularly difficult attacks. Soldiers would line up with their mess tins or small flasks, and officers would carefully measure out the 100 grams. In practice, enforcement varied considerably. Some units maintained strict adherence to the regulations. Others were more flexible, allowing soldiers to save their rations for special occasions or share them with comrades. Black markets inevitably developed, with soldiers trading vodka for cigarettes, food, or other goods. The policy was not universal even at its peak. The 100-gram ration applied specifically to combat units engaged in active operations. Support personnel, those in rear areas, and soldiers not in contact with the enemy received reduced rations, or none at all. This created a clear hierarchy within the Red Army, where the vodka ration became a symbol of frontline service and shared sacrifice. Soldiers who received the full ration wore it as a badge of honor, proof that they were in the thick of the fighting rather than safely behind the lines. The policy also evolved over time in response to changing circumstances and available resources. During the desperate winter of 1941 and 42, when German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow and the survival of the Soviet state hung in the balance, the vodka ration took on almost sacred significance. Soldiers fighting in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat in the ruins of villages and cities, looked forward to their evening 100 grams as one of the few reliable comforts in an existence defined by cold, hunger, and death. The Battle of Moscow, which raged from October 1941 through January 1942, demonstrated both the utility and the limitations of the vodka ration. Soviet forces, reinforced by fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, launched a massive counteroffensive on December 5th, catching German troops exhausted and ill-prepared for winter warfare. The Red Army drove the Wehrmacht back from the capital, inflicting the first major defeat on Hitler's forces since the war began. Soldiers who participated in this offensive later recalled the importance of small comforts during the campaign. The 100 grams of vodka, the daily ration of bread, the occasional hot meal. These became anchors of normalcy in a world turned upside down. Veterans remembered drinking their vodka ration before going over the top in attacks, feeling the warmth spread through their bodies, the edge of fear dulled just enough to allow them to advance into machine gun fire. They remembered sharing their rations with wounded comrades, using vodka to toast the dead, and drinking to forget the things they had witnessed. The vodka ration became woven into the fabric of frontline culture, inseparable from the experience of serving in the Red Army during the Great Patriotic War. By 1942, as the war entered its second year, the vodka ration policy faced increasing scrutiny. Medical officers reported growing concerns about alcohol dependency among long-serving soldiers. Discipline problems related to drinking were documented in numerous units. Commanders noted instances where soldiers hoarded their rations to consume larger quantities at once, leading to intoxication and reduced combat readiness. There were reports of soldiers trading essential equipment for additional vodka. The People's Commissariat of Defense issued multiple directives attempting to regulate distribution more strictly, emphasizing that the ration was a privilege that could be revoked for disciplinary infractions and that commanders were personally responsible for ensuring it did not interfere with military effectiveness. Despite these concerns, the policy continued, in part because it remained popular with the troops, and in part because Soviet leadership believed the benefits outweighed the costs. The vodka ration served as a form of compensation for the extraordinary hardships soldiers endured. Red Army pay was minimal, and soldiers had few opportunities to spend money at the front anyway. The vodka ration represented a tangible benefit, something the state provided that soldiers valued highly. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 until January 1944, presented unique challenges for the vodka ration policy. The city was completely cut off from land-based supply routes, connected to the rest of the Soviet Union only by the treacherous road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga during winter months. Food was so scarce that hundreds of thousands of civilians died of starvation. Yet, even under these desperate circumstances, Soviet authorities maintained vodka rations for combat troops defending the city. The decision reflected the priority placed on keeping soldiers functional and willing to fight. Civilians might starve, but soldiers needed to maintain their positions against constant German and Finnish attacks. The vodka came across the ice road, along with ammunition and minimal food supplies, testimony to how essential the Soviet command considered it to military operations. Soldiers defending Leningrad faced not only enemy fire, but also the psychological torment of watching the civilian population slowly die of hunger while they received preferential rations. The vodka helped dull the guilt and the horror, allowing them to continue fighting day after day in a siege that seemed to have no end. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, became the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front and the crucible in which the Red Army was forged into a truly effective fighting force. In the ruins of the city, Soviet and German soldiers fought building by building, room by room, sometimes separated by a single wall. The combat was intimate and savage, conducted with rifles, grenades, knives, and entrenching tools. Soldiers on both sides suffered from constant stress, inadequate sleep, poor nutrition, and the ever-present threat of death. In this environment, the vodka ration took on renewed importance. Soviet soldiers defending Stalingrad received their 100 grams religiously, often in the brief periods of darkness when supply boats could cross the Volga River under cover of night. The ritual of distribution, the familiar burn of the alcohol, the momentary relaxation it provided, these became crucial psychological anchors. Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army that defended the city, understood the importance of maintaining morale through small gestures and reliable routines. The vodka ration was one such routine, a promise that the state had not forgotten the soldiers fighting and dying in the rubble. As the war progressed and the Red Army transitioned from desperate defense to strategic offense, the vodka ration policy remained in place, but its character evolved. After the victory at Stalingrad and the massive tank battle at Kursk in July 1943, Soviet forces began the long advance westward that would eventually carry them to Berlin. Soldiers who had survived the darkest days of 1941 and 42 became veterans, hardened by experiences that would have broken less resilient men. For these veterans, the vodka ration was a tradition, a link to fallen comrades, and a symbol of continuity. New recruits joining the army learned about the 100 grams as part of their initiation into frontline culture. The policy had become institutionalized, embedded in the routines and expectations of military life. Soviet war correspondents and propagandists sometimes mentioned the vodka ration in their dispatches, presenting it as evidence of the state's care for its soldiers and as part of the authentic Russian character of the Red Army. The final campaigns of the war, from the liberation of Soviet territory through the conquest of Eastern Europe and into Germany itself, saw the vodka ration continue uninterrupted. When Soviet forces crossed into Poland in 1944, when they liberated the death camps and saw firsthand the full extent of Nazi atrocities, when they fought their way through East Prussia and Pomerania into the heart of the Reich, the 100 grams remained a constant. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945, the final major operation of the war in Europe, involved more than 2 million Soviet troops in a massive assault on the German capital. Soldiers fighting through the city's streets, clearing buildings, and advancing toward the Reichstag received their vodka rations amid the ruins of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The victory celebrations that followed Germany's surrender on May 8th saw vodka flow freely, far exceeding the official 100-gram ration, as soldiers marked the end of 4 years of unimaginable suffering and sacrifice. The human cost of the vodka ration policy is impossible to calculate with precision, but it was undoubtedly significant. Alcohol dependency became widespread among Red Army veterans. Many soldiers who survived the war found themselves unable to function without regular drinking. The Soviet Union's long-standing problems with alcoholism were exacerbated by the return of millions of men who had spent years consuming daily vodka rations and using alcohol to cope with trauma. The state made minimal provisions for treating what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder and substance abuse. Veterans were expected to return to civilian life, rebuild the shattered country, and resume normal existence as if the war had never happened. For many, this proved impossible. The vodka ration, which had helped them survive the war, became a curse in peacetime. Soviet society in the post-war decades struggled with epidemic levels of alcoholism, and while the causes were complex and multifaceted, the wartime vodka ration policy certainly contributed to normalizing heavy drinking and establishing it as a coping mechanism for an entire generation. The policy also had broader implications for Soviet military culture that extended well beyond World War II. The vodka ration became part of the mythology of the Great Patriotic War, remembered as one of the distinctive features of the Soviet fighting experience. When the Soviet Union engaged in subsequent conflicts, from the suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 to the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, vodka remained an unofficial but ubiquitous presence in Soviet military operations. The formal 100-gram ration was not reinstituted, but commanders tacitly accepted that soldiers would drink, and alcohol was often made available through unofficial channels. Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan frequently turned to vodka and other substances to cope with the stress of counterinsurgency warfare in a hostile environment. The patterns established during World War II, the acceptance of alcohol as a tool for managing combat stress and maintaining morale, persisted throughout the Soviet period and beyond. From a military history perspective, The Soviet vodka ration policy represents a pragmatic response to the specific challenges of total war under extreme conditions. The Red Army in 1941 faced an existential threat. The Nazi invasion aimed not merely at military defeat, but at the complete destruction of the Soviet state and the enslavement or extermination of its population. In this context, Soviet leadership made decisions based on immediate survival rather than long-term social consequences. The vodka ration was one such decision, a calculated trade-off that accepted future problems with alcoholism in exchange for maintaining combat effectiveness during the war. Whether this trade-off was justified remains a matter of debate. The Red Army did survive, did stop the Wehrmacht, and did ultimately triumph, at a cost of approximately 8 to 10 million military dead. How many of those deaths might have been prevented with different policies is unknowable. How many soldiers were saved from psychological collapse by the vodka ration is equally impossible to determine. What is clear is that the policy reflected a particular approach to military manpower, one that viewed soldiers as resources to be sustained through the immediate crisis with less concern for their long-term welfare. The vodka ration also illuminates the relationship between the Soviet state and its citizens during the war. The Stalinist system was characterized by extraordinary brutality, with millions of people killed or imprisoned during the purges, collectivization, and the terror of the 1930s. Yet during the war, the state needed its citizens to fight with determination and courage. The vodka ration was one of the tools used to secure that cooperation, a small benefit provided in exchange for the ultimate sacrifice. It represented a form of social contract, however limited. The state acknowledged that soldiers, enduring unimaginable hardship, deserved some compensation, some small comfort in return for their service. This acknowledgement coexisted with the harsh discipline of the Red Army, the blocking detachments that shot retreating soldiers, and Order No. 227 of July 1942, which declared that not one step backward would be tolerated and established penal battalions for those deemed cowards. The vodka ration was the carrot accompanying the stick, the reward that made the punishment system more bearable. In the decades since World War II, the 100-gram vodka ration has been remembered differently by different groups. For veterans, it remained a point of pride, a symbol of their service, and the unique character of the Red Army's wartime experience. Soviet and later Russian popular culture incorporated the vodka ration into the mythology of the Great Patriotic War, presenting it as evidence of Russian toughness and the authentic, unpretentious nature of the Soviet soldier. Western observers often cited the policy as evidence of Russian alcoholism and the supposedly primitive character of the Red Army, missing the historical context and the calculated reasoning behind the decision. Military historians have examined the vodka ration as part of broader studies of how armies maintain morale and combat effectiveness under extreme stress, comparing it to similar policies in other militaries. The British Navy's rum ration, which continued until 1970, served similar functions. The American military's tolerance of heavy drinking among troops in rear areas during World War II reflected comparable acceptance of alcohol as a coping mechanism. The Soviet policy was distinctive in its formalization and universality, but the underlying logic was not unique to the Red Army. The legacy of the 100-gram vodka ration extends into the present day. The Russian Federation, inheritor of Soviet military traditions, does not officially maintain alcohol rations for its armed forces, but drinking remains deeply embedded in military culture. The patterns established during World War II, reinforced through decades of Soviet military practice, continue to shape how Russian soldiers relate to alcohol. The ongoing problems with alcoholism in the Russian military, documented by numerous reports and investigations, have roots that extend back to the wartime vodka ration and the broader acceptance of heavy drinking that it represented. At the same time, the memory of the vodka ration serves as a cultural touchstone, a reminder of the sacrifices made during the Great Patriotic War and the distinctive character of the Russian military experience. In a society that continues to grapple with the legacy of World War II and uses that legacy to shape national identity, the 100-gram vodka ration occupies a complex position, simultaneously celebrated as part of the heroic war effort and recognized as contributing to long-term social problems. The decision made in August 1941 to issue 100 grams of vodka daily to Red Army soldiers was neither arbitrary nor irrational. It emerged from a specific historical moment when the Soviet Union faced annihilation and its leadership made calculated decisions about how to sustain an army under conditions of total war. The policy drew on centuries of Russian military tradition, reflected pragmatic understanding of how alcohol affects human psychology and physiology, and represented an acknowledgement that soldiers, enduring extreme hardship, needed more than ideology to keep fighting. The consequences of this decision extended far beyond the war itself, shaping Soviet military culture, contributing to endemic alcoholism, and becoming part of the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. Understanding the vodka ration requires moving beyond stereotypes and examining the brutal calculus of survival that governed decision-making during the most destructive conflict in human history. It stands as a reminder that war forces societies to make impossible choices, trading future problems for immediate survival, and that the costs of those choices echo across generations long after the guns fall silent.